And once again, welcome everyone to the Jason Howell Company Speaker Series Zoominars. My name is Jason Howell, and today we have a great and topical episode to talk with you today. And while I speak a little bit, I'll admit folks in here so they all can be a part of it. 2 weeks ago, there was a Supreme Court ruling that was quite controversial, reversing Roe v. Wade in the 1973 case. Some people see it as political, others see it as a women's and reproductive rights issue. But what can any of us do about it? What can we do when we can't maybe go to the ballot box? Is there another mechanism? Perhaps there is. I'll offer that maybe there's the corporate box that we could go to. And to talk more about that, we have someone from corporate America, a Miss Dora Lowson, who is president and COO of Change Finance. Now, before we pepper her with a bunch of questions around corporate engagement, around proxy voting, let's just meet Dora the person. Dora, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jason. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm glad you're here. Tell us, how has your day been? What do people do when they're presidents and COO of a fund family like Change Finance?
Oh, Jason, it's been a busy day and we do all sorts of things. So today I finalized the board book for our quarterly board meeting next week. I worked on an RFP from a big investment firm looking for a new asset manager. I did some work towards our next product launch, all sorts of different things on my calendar.
Okay, so you're not just talking about controversial issues all day, you're actually doing some real tangible finance type work.
Indeed.
Well, we're glad to have you here today. I think we've let most of the folks in. It's going to be a great, probably wide-ranging conversation, but really in this case, focused on how you do the kind of work you do through a fund family and how maybe many of us can participate in that. Are you ready for us?
I am.
Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. So if you came to the Roe v. Wade reversal, Change Finance Responds, you've come to the right Zoominar. Dora, we're so glad you are here, taking time out of what sounds like a pretty busy day. And so we'll get right to getting to know you a little bit better and asking you some questions. But before we do, let's first have a word from our sponsor. Jason Howell Company is a family wealth management firm, and our job is to help you feel good about your money. And we do this in a few different ways, a few different specific ways. We're one of the few firms that actually walks through a family governance program, where at the end of it, after interviews with the two principals of the family, typically the spouses, we'll have a conversation around the past and the present and the future legacy you want to build with money. And then at that point, build a family constitution for the entire family to kind of know where are your standards, where are your goals, what are your values. That's one. We also participate in sustainable investing, and this fund family, Change Finance, has been helpful in that regard. And then finally, we also walk through the normal financial plan, of course, but looking also at planning for philanthropy. Most of the clients that we work with have a heart for actual causes that are important to them. Kids and causes, we sometimes say. So we talk about posterity, we talk about charity, we talk about values, and that's what makes Jason Howell Company unique. But enough about that. Let's talk about someone else who's pretty darn unique, Miss Dora Lowson, who is president and COO of Change Finance. Now, if you registered for this before, you had a chance to read some of her bio, and hopefully you saw what I saw. Someone who is interesting, different, who hasn't done just one thing in her life. It stretches anywhere from IT, a deep dive into the environment, and of course, now most specifically, finance. But Dora, maybe you can give us a little idea. For example, I've highlighted this organization, Agora Partnerships. What led you there?
You know, that's a great question, Jason. I had been living in China and I moved back to the US looking for really the next thing that made me feel like I was making a real difference in the world. I didn't know exactly what this looked like. And a fortuitous connection with somebody from my very small alma mater led to my role at Agora Partnerships. He was the founder of the organization, and it was a really exciting, interesting organization working to help small companies in Latin America that had a real mission to do good things in the world, to make a difference on the climate, to make a difference in the lives of women and other mission-oriented activities, but to do that in a for-profit way. And our goal at Agora Partnerships was to help those businesses succeed in all sorts of ways, but especially with respect to access to capital, which was difficult for them to come by in order to grow.
And these were companies in Latin America. So this is part of your international experience through China, then Latin America.
Exactly. I've really done a little of everything in a lot of different regions of the world.
And is this where you kind of cut your teeth on impact investing, impact finance?
It is. It is. That's definitely where I dove into the field. So I started it in a sense at the bottom with small businesses and early stage investing, but always with a real focus on impact. And then as I grew and changed and evolved, I spent some more time back in China. But when I came back to the United States, I was really looking for the next place where I could have really big impact. And all of those small businesses at the beginnings of their life cycle are critically important. I think they are where a lot of innovation happens. But I also have seen over time that the biggest change is when we really want to change things systemically across the nation or across the world. The world's largest corporations have outsized power. And so finding ways to influence them felt to me like the next place where I could have the biggest impact I knew how as an individual.
Okay, that's fascinating. And Paris Climate Agreement is highlighted here in your bio, and that's another issue that's oddly become controversial most recently. As a person who has been involved in this space and internationally involved, do you see this idea of sustainable impact investing as new, or do you see it as something that's been around for a long time and now, say, the United States is waking up to it?
It's certainly something that's been around for a long time. There are certain segments of the population that have always invested this way. I happen to go to a Quaker college, and impact investing and the shape that it's taking is something that Quakers have always done. And the kinds of factors that we now call ESG are things that Quakers have always thought about in their investment decisions. But over the last several years, we have really seen a focus on environmental factors, on social factors, on the impact that businesses have go mainstream. We've seen investors across the spectrum waking up to the idea that these are not just factors that come from sort of a place of wanting to do good in the world, although that's certainly important, but also they are factors that actually are material to how companies perform.
Materiality, I think that's an accounting term, having majored in accounting. And so that tends to be important for anyone who wants to analyze the future opportunities, the going concerns of businesses.
It certainly does. And so we view materiality broadly, traditionally, and especially in public market investing. It's really focused on very specific financial and governance kinds of issues. And we think the data shows that environmental and social issues are absolutely meaningful as well. There's really good data to show, for example, how diversity correlates with better corporate performance. And increasingly environmental issues are material because of the risk we face from climate change.
And I'm sure you're doing a lot of that work, analyzing a lot of different companies and the like through your fund, and we'll talk more about that. Before we move off of your bio here, can you tell us about your work with Mentor Capital Network?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. It's really fun to get to work on an ongoing basis with small businesses doing good. So Mentor Capital Network works a little bit in the same space that Agora Partnerships does. It works with very early stage businesses that are designed to have a beneficial impact in the world. And Mentor Capital Networks focuses on connecting those businesses with expert mentors from a variety of areas that can help them move their businesses forward. So I participate most years in reviewing and providing feedback on business plans to a variety of businesses, and then often having follow-up conversation and sometimes settling into longer-term mentorship relationships. And for me, it's just a really exciting way to help the field continue to develop, to see what really exciting, interesting things are going on out there. Sometimes I can help connect those businesses to sources of finance. So it's continues the passion that I started at Agora Partnerships. And in fact, I came to know Mentor Capital Network because I sat in a co-working space at the next desk over from the founder or the executive director.
Okay, so you're a mentor. You've lived in China. You've got this IT background. You're obviously a finance person now. If any of you would like to hang out with Dora, her email address is right underneath her name. I recommend you do it. See if you can get on her calendar. There is so much to this person in addition to her function at Change Finance. Okay, let's get to some of our Q&A. Huge deal. Roe v. Wade reversal about 2 weeks ago. And there has been so much spoken about it. There will continue to be more spoken about it. But what happens on the corporate side, especially from the investing side? How can people, for whatever issue that's really something that is a passion of yours, how can you get involved with and through corporate America? Well, the first question I have for Dora is, what exactly is corporate engagement?
Great question, Jason. Corporate engagement really describes a whole suite of tools by which investors can influence the companies that they invest in. If you are invested in a company, you have a right to communicate with that company about how they do business. Every company will have somewhere on its website an investor relations page. You can go there and find out how to contact investor relations and tell them what you're thinking, what you care about, what kinds of policies you think are important for them to pursue. So I think it's a really important way that everybody can get involved. We sometimes think about our purchasing decisions in light of how companies behave. When a company has been in the news for doing something we really object to, maybe we decide not to buy their products for a while. We can have a voice as well through this corporate engagement or shareholder advocacy work with companies from the investor side. And that's another way of bringing our opinions to bear on how corporations behave. Many of the folks watching probably are invested through mutual funds and ETFs in lieu of or in addition to direct holdings. And you can hold your asset managers, the people managing those funds, accountable for how they do corporate engagement. So that can be an important part of your research when you're deciding which funds to invest in.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I think most people today, quote unquote today, have fallen into that passive investing world, seeing the opportunities through funds like yours, for example, and they think, well, I can't do anything here. I have a fund of many different companies. What do they care what I say? And you're saying if that is the case, they look through either their ETF or their mutual fund, they should reach out to that fund family, whether it's Vanguard or it's iShares or whatever else, and ask them what they're doing?
Last night.
Absolutely. You should be able to find out how the funds that you're invested in is voting its proxies and what they're doing by way of corporate engagement. And just like you can reach out directly to a corporation through their investor relations page to let them know what you think, I encourage you also to reach out to the funds that you're holding and let them know how that you're paying attention to their corporate engagement work. You can ask for reporting on it. You can look at proxy voting records. All of those are things that you can do to influence how they are engaging with companies and on what issues.
You also had mentioned that, very similar to people saying, I don't appreciate what this company is doing, and so instead of buying Coca-Cola, I'm going to buy Pepsi from now on, which would never happen, by the way. But you say people can now look at the way they invest and do something similar.
Absolutely. If you find Coca-Cola doing something objectionable and you think Pepsi's behavior is better, don't just decide not to buy Coca-Cola and only to buy Pepsi. But maybe you don't want to invest in Coca-Cola and you only want to invest in Pepsi. Or maybe you want to invest in Coca-Cola and use that opportunity of being invested to tell them what you think and how you want them to change.
And I think this question might be sort of answered in the next one. So I'll start by the next question on our list today, which is, what exactly is proxy voting?
Great question. So if you are invested, especially if you're invested directly in individual companies, you probably every year get in the mail, or maybe now in your email, a big long document on thin paper and very fine print that tells you a bunch of really incomprehensible stuff. And if you are like I was until I entered this field, it probably goes straight in the trash. But actually, that document is pretty important. It has a lot of important information on it about what the company is up to, who is making decisions for the company. So it gives you an opportunity to vote on the board of directors for that company. And it typically will contain a variety of shareholder proposals. And in recent years, a rapidly growing number of those proposals are on issues you might really care about. What is their climate change policy? What is their diversity policy? How are they spending their lobbying dollars? What are they lobbying for? Or can you even find out what they're lobbying for? How are they spending their political contributions? Are they making political contributions? Do they share with you what political contributions they're making? All of those things are worth knowing about and can help you make investment decisions. And you have the opportunity every year to vote on those proposals. So I encourage you not to throw those documents away, even though they're pretty daunting, but to look through them. And there are a number of places where you can get some guidance and advice on how to vote. Majority Action and As You Sow are two great organizations that do a lot of research and provide pretty accessible voter guides on social and environmental issues, particularly. So there are a growing number of tools to help you make those decisions. And then you are entitled to vote your proxies. Usually these days, there's a way to do it online. It's relatively straightforward. Those documents will typically come with a URL or a QR code you can follow to a site where you vote on the issues on that particular ballot. And so when you're holding companies directly, I encourage you to start to learn how to do that. And when you're not holding companies directly, when you're invested through funds, as is often the case, it's another place where you can try and hold those funds accountable. You can find out how they are voting. It's not always easy, but every fund is required to report on its voting record to the SEC. And you can obtain those records are public. You can obtain those records and start to uncover how companies are voting, how funds are voting. And then again, you can make decisions on which funds to invest in part based on those voting records. Or you can contact funds and let them know how you feel about how they're voting and how you would like them to vote.
Dora, this sounds pretty good. To some people, this might be new, but it also sounds like if I'm not a millionaire, I probably can't make any impact. No one's going to listen to what I say or what have you. Is that correct?
Not at all. What's been really surprising to me as I have really gotten into this area is how much influence it is possible to have, even with relatively modest holdings. I'll give you a personal example, actually. I work with a financial advisor to manage my personal assets who's really focused on shareholder engagement and shareholder advocacy. And she came to me last year and asked, could she use my holdings in a particular company to sponsor a proposal on the ballot for that company. Each proposal has to be sponsored by a shareholder that meets certain criteria. What that meant is I signed a letter designating her effectively as my proxy, is somebody acting on my behalf, and filed that resolution, which passed with a significant percentage of the vote. Just by the fact I didn't have millions of dollars invested in that company. I had maybe a few hundred shares. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but not vast wealth. So it doesn't take vast wealth to file a shareholder resolution. I don't know that if you're brand new to it, you'd want to do it yourself. I'm not sure I would want to do it myself.
Okay.
But yeah. there are folks out there who do it regularly, who know how to do it. And often they might want to look for co-sponsors. There are opportunities to co-sponsor, but you don't have to sponsor a resolution to vote. And you don't have to be holding a lot of shares of a company to vote. So even an investment of a few hundred or a few $1,000s gives you rights as a shareholder to vote those shares.
Wow, a few hundred or a few thousand, that does really make a difference, doesn't it?
It does, and in fact, depending on the trading price of a share, maybe even less than a few hundred.
Right. I guess one share of Amazon at $3,000, for example, might be enough. I think the limits, even the new limits put into place this year, I think it's $2,000 of stock held for a year, something like that.
Uh-huh. I don't remember exactly, but I think something like that.
Yeah, it's less than people would think, and thank you for sharing that and letting people know. And so, the topic of the day, after we've gotten that background, is this Roe v. Wade reversal. Why was this reversal bad for business?
That's a great question, Jason, and we can debate the morality of abortion till the cows come home. And I'm happy to do that with you if you want.
Your email address is on the other slide.
I'm not shy about my opinion, but morality aside, this decision has far-reaching consequences, not only for women and families and other pregnant people, but also for businesses. It has real consequences. For example, 71% of Americans believe that reproductive decisions should be left to the patient and the doctor. And this matters because a recent poll found that 75% of women and 58% of men said that restrictive abortion laws like the one in Texas would discourage them from working in those states. And nearly as many, 73% of women and 53% of men, said they wouldn't even apply for a job in a state that had a similar ban. Right now, nearly half of states in this country have very restrictive abortion laws on the books that were triggered by the Roe v. Wade decision 2 weeks ago. That means in half the country, companies have suddenly seen their pool of potential employees slashed by 3/4 or almost 3/4. That's an enormous cut in the pool of available employees, and that has a huge impact on business. That makes recruiting much more difficult. It makes retention much more difficult. And those are really essential to be able to develop and grow a successful business. If you can't attract employees because they don't want to live where you do business, that's bad for business. We also know that expectations for companies have changed. Stakeholders increasingly expect companies to take a stand on social issues. 80% of the world's largest public companies have made public commitments to gender diversity. And 86% of women say that controlling if and when to have children has been important to their careers. It's pretty hard to achieve your gender diversity goals if the vast majority of women believe that reproductive rights are important to their careers, and half the country no longer supports those rights. So it's a big deal for businesses, and meeting those commitments is important because it affects what we call social license risk. That is effectively reputational risk. It's the effect on businesses of negative reputational consequences. So if they have made a public commitment to gender diversity, for example, and they can't meet it, that could have reputational harm. That could cause customers to decline and affect the bottom line. It could cause investors to pull back. And that's really meaningful and impacts business. So this decision has real and meaningful consequences for business and the success of business, and particularly in the states where it has caused radical alterations to the laws.
So often when we think about sustainable investing, we think E for environmental, but not typically so much on the S for social and G for governance, which is almost always about risk. And so what I'm hearing you say is there's an S and G risk here with the reversal and what the Supreme Court has put upon now businesses and states to decipher.
Absolutely. I think the risk is significant and consequential.
And how else do you see this being bad for business, maybe beyond recruiting, maybe beyond retention? How does this particular, the way this is put out there and now states are having their actions, how does this affect, the growth, the profits of business?
That's a really good question. There's a recent study that estimates that eliminating abortion restrictions nationwide would result in a 1.15% growth in the labor force participation and a 9.12% growth in private sector earnings. That's almost 10% growth in earnings. Wow. From making that policy change. That's not nothing.
I imagine not. Now, I know your fund, Change Finance, you have 100 companies in your fund, and you go through E, S, and G factors as you build that fund for people to invest in so that they can feel that this, I think, one of the only certified fossil fuel free funds out there is something that they want to invest in. So I'm sure people are interested in saying, all right, well, how is Change Finance, if this is an issue that's near and personal to the president and COO, how is Change Finance working to mitigate harm to businesses in their portfolio?
Great question. We are working very hard right now, sort of behind the scenes. This is really our first public facing announcement of the project that we are working on. So thank you for giving me the platform. Sure. We are ramping up an engagement effort that's really focused on how corporations respond to the Roe v. Wade decision. So we talked a little bit earlier in the conversation about proxy voting and about corporate engagement, and that's exactly what we're looking to do first on the engagement front. So we expect within the next couple of weeks to send a letter to every company in our portfolio asking for three things. The first is that they commit publicly to cover costs for pregnant employees who need to access abortion care out of state in states where they do business and where that care is no longer accessible. For lots of the reasons that we've just discussed, we believe that doing so is good for business. We also are asking that they examine their political contributions and halt political contributions to politicians who support limitations on reproductive rights and abortion access. We talked a little bit about how policy intersects corporate performance and how policy makes it more difficult for corporations to be successful. So this gets at that issue. We also ask them to be transparent about political contributions. That's not something that most companies reliably do. But as investors, we cannot assess whether they are meeting commitments that they may make related to political contributions unless there is transparency in reporting to support that. And then finally, in a similar vein, we are asking for transparency around their lobbying activities. And that they cease any lobbying activities that might support restrictions on reproductive rights. And again, we believe that is valuable for business and material to business in all of the ways that we have already discussed. So that will go out, as I said, over the next couple of weeks. We expect to help build a coalition of investors and asset managers who care about this issue. That's been part of our practice in our corporate engagement work and another way that we are able to magnify the influence we have by bringing others in and creating a mechanism where other fund managers and investors can pile on to what we are doing, so we don't all have to do all of the work on any given issue independently. So I expect that we will be able to circle up a number of other investors and go out to companies with a pretty strong voice that says, investors representing billions, I hope, trillions, if we really do our marketing well, of dollars, of investment dollars, believe that this is the thing to do and is important. And then it begins, I think, usually a relatively long process in this case because of the immediacy of the issue. I hope that we'll see some action relatively quickly on certain items, and begins a process of engagement. We hope to have dialogues with companies, helping educate them so they understand why we believe this is material to their business, and why it's an issue we care about as investors, and how they can execute on it efficiently and effectively. And in best case scenario, we're able to do that through engagement, and have companies come to do what we hope they will do voluntarily, and because they see how it's right. Sometimes that doesn't work, and you move up towards, say, a shareholder resolution, which, while non-binding, if it passes, is a pretty significant statement of investor intention. And at some point, it may begin to affect our investment decision making. It may begin to factor into our choice. In this particular instance, I think there's a long path from here to there, partly due to data availability, and partly because we think this is a broad issue that affects all companies, and something to work on systematically and systemically.
Thank you for that, Dora. Thorough response. I've got a follow-up question for you, but I want to get to the chat here. And the first question here is, do you have a sense as to how many of the companies will agree to those 3 points that you presented? And if they're not ready to sign, will there be some education to sort of help them make that decision differently? Or what's your back and forth there?
Absolutely. So a couple of dozen companies, roughly, I don't have the number exactly in my head, have already made public statements committing to support access to abortion for all of their employees, regardless of where they live, which is encouraging. It means that we have examples to hold forth to say, you can do this, because other companies have already done it. What we have typically seen in these portfolio-wide engagements is some companies, we get no response, and we just continue to follow up periodically to keep this issue in front of them as something that we pay attention to. Others will reach back out to us and let us know how they're working towards it or what they're already doing, and then we'll typically kind of monitor that and check back. Maybe they say, look for the reporting you're asking for in our next report that comes out at the end of the year, say. Then we'll know to check back, and if they've met our goal, great. If they haven't, we might follow up with what else we'd like to see. Sometimes they'll ask for a conversation, and that's great. That's an education opportunity to speak with them about why we think it's important, what the data shows, why the data supports what we're asking for, how they might go about doing what it is that we're asking them to do. Sometimes we're able to connect them with expert resources on the issue, or bring experts to the conversation. Sometimes that just keeps the issue front of mind, and it's an ongoing conversation. What we generally find, as long as we feel like a company is sincerely considering and working towards our objectives, we stay engaged and stay in dialogue. But it's not necessarily an overnight process. So we expect to work on this for a long time.
This is so interesting, Dorit, because it is so different from, say, just the technique of leading a protest outside the headquarters. If I
Mhm,
can review these points again that you made, what you said is you're sending each of these 100 companies that make up your fund a letter. And in that letter, you're requesting information. So you're really requesting, transparency in all of these categories. It
mhm.
sounds like, right?
Yep.
You want to know how they're covering costs for interstate travel for people who have these needs. Number one, you are also wanting to take a look at political contributions, which
Mhm,
some people argue should be transparent and should be out there consistently anyway.
mhm,
But now you're really asking for it. And you also are looking into a window into their lobbying practices. Thanks to another Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, there are
mhm,
many ways to make this dark and
mhm,
unviewable. And you're asking companies that you are supporting through your fund to at least be transparent with you and your investors. And your thought process around this, if I can summarize this properly or accurately, is by having this information, being able to make decisions, maybe even being able to have conversations with these firms, then you can band with others who may feel the same way about these issues. And together, as you had mentioned earlier, perhaps co-sponsor resolutions speaking to the things that you view to be important. And these resolutions, I guess these will be spoken about in the annual meetings if they make it that far, so that boards of directors will have to discuss this. Is that right?
mhm. They will get, typically when you get to the annual meeting, there's not a lot of discussion that happens. The discussion has already happened, and the goal really is actually not to file a shareholder resolution. The goal is to get the company to agree to what you want, to hold the threat, if you have to get that far, to hold the threat of a shareholder resolution as sort of a stick to get the companies to agree. And often, once you file a shareholder resolution, companies will come to the table and negotiate and agree to make progress so that you withdraw the shareholder resolutions. That's really the ultimate goal, is to change behavior. If that doesn't happen and they won't come to the table, or they aren't willing to make meaningful progress, then you file the shareholder resolution. At the shareholder meeting, it is read into the record, uh, along potentially with a statement of support from the sponsor, and then the vote is called. There's not in fact usually a lot of back and forth discussion, but hopefully discussion has happened ahead of time, and certainly the board of directors is present and has to and hears the resolution and sees the results of the vote, so they can see how many investors are paying attention and care about the issue.
And this isn't quite like political voting, where if only 36% or 49% of the shareholders are for an issue, then they're just going to ignore it. Many times, as I understand, it's if they see a lot of action towards it, that may cause decisions by the board of directors just by seeing all of that support and activity, even at a threshold below 50%.
Exactly. That can certainly be the case, and there where maybe a resolution gets 30 or 40%, or maybe got 5 or 6% of the vote the first year it was put on the ballot, and then it comes back on the ballot and it gets 30% of the vote, and that trajectory shows companies that investors are really paying attention, and they don't want to wait until it passes with 70% of the vote or 80% of the
Sure.
vote. In many cases, that's a strong enough signal that this is something people care about, as something that they need to work on, and that can circle around and factor later into an investor's decision-making process about what they will and won't invest in. And ultimately, it can factor into the social license risk that we talked about earlier. What's been interesting to me over the last few years as the number of environmental and social proposals on ballots has increased, the news is spreading further and more, becoming more mainstream, and people who maybe don't really read the investment news part of their favorite news source are starting to hear sometimes about things that are happening, and that can make them, as consumers, think differently about companies that they are investing in. I mean, whose products they are buying. And that comes back to that question of social license risk. Does it affect the reputation of the company in ways that affect the company's business?
You mean not everyone reads investment news daily? That's impossible. Another question here in the chat that I want to get to before getting to our last question. There are many legislative matters that can impact reproductive freedom. Voting rights, gerrymandering come to mind. How do you evaluate these lobbying activities to determine what would cause you to screen out a company?
Great question. And as you point out, it's non-trivial, it's complex. There are lots of different issues. In fact, in some ways, this particular engagement activity that we are taking, focused around the Roe v. Wade decision, is a continuation of engagement work we started about a year ago in response to the events of January 6th and others related to voting rights and other things that, again, was looking at transparency in political contributions and lobbying. So this is showing how pervasive that concern is and how many different issues it touches on, and how interconnected they are. My personal position, speaking now as an individual, not necessarily as a representative of the company, is that companies shouldn't be making political contributions. And I would like to see transparency in political contributions that say political contributions 0. Lobbying is a little bit more complex because there's policy that's really directly targets regulation of specific businesses or industries. And while I think it's important that those decisions are made objectively and by experts who understand the issues and understand their impact both inside and outside of the businesses also do have expertise in the area and have reason to weigh in. But I think that those activities, if they happen at all, should be construed narrowly and should be really focused on making sure that regulation is done in a way that makes sense. And I'll give an example actually from inside the financial industry of what I mean. The SEC is working on new rules that will affect funds like the one Change Finance operates, that have to do with environmental, social, and governance, use of environmental, social, and governance factors, and how that's written about. I am a big supporter of that kind of regulation. I think the industry needs it. Much as I dislike compliance and the challenges of complying with SEC regulation, I do believe that it serves a function that's important. But I am participating in a task force focused on a response to the proposed rules, not because I want to quash the rules, but because I want to make sure that the rules actually make sense and will have the best chance of resulting in the outcomes the SEC is seeking in a way that is not unnecessarily onerous. The compliance burden is pretty high, and especially for smaller firms, it can eat up a lot of our day that could be spent doing other things. So I believe in the rules. I believe that we should comply with the rules, but I also believe that we should find processes and procedures that are as lightweight as possible in order to achieve the target outcomes. So in that sense, I think lobbying, if you want to call it that, from inside the industry is valuable and important. But lobbying, sort of broad lobbying activities that we might see are more questionable. And we would certainly want to understand what is happening so we can make decisions.
Sounds like you're looking for balance even in lobbying, which is always a push and pull as you go forward. Let me ask this last question. You've spoken eloquently about what a fund can do to impact change within corporate America, partnering with many other people who share certain sets of values. What can individuals do? And maybe you touched on them earlier, to affect corporate policies that they want to see in the world?
Sure. I mentioned that every company will have an investor relations page somewhere on their website. Not always easy to find. Sometimes you got to scroll to the footer and dig around, because the tabs at the top may very well be focused on their consumers. But it's there. You can find it, and it will tell you a bunch of kind of investor-oriented information about the company. You'll be able to get corporate reports and other things. And it will tell you how to contact investor relations. So I don't know about you, but I'm pretty politically engaged, and I regularly am writing to my Congress people about whatever is on my mind that I think they should know and act on. You can do the same thing with corporate leadership through those investor relations pages. You can reach out to them and let them know you're paying attention. And you don't actually have to own shares in the company to use that investor outreach. You can do it if you own shares directly. You can do it if you own shares through a fund. You can do it if you don't own shares, and reach out to them and tell them why you don't own shares and choose not to invest in that company, and what they could do differently to change that. So you do have a voice, and just like your political representatives do, companies collate that information and pay attention, because ultimately, if there's enough communication about a particular topic or a particular direction, they have to pay attention, because that could affect their social license. It could affect what comes up at their shareholder meetings, and it can affect how they appear in the news, and ultimately potentially can affect their share price.
Well, yeah, I will take away, you do have a voice. That's excellent news.
You do, and I encourage you to use it.
Okay, for now, I'm going to stop the share, so get ready for a big face. Those photos weren't big enough. And I just want to thank you, Dora, for coming here, answering questions, being incredibly lucid, and giving us point by point by point about not only what Change Finance is doing, but also what we could do through our fund families, other investments that we have, and even as individuals to affect change that we see that is necessary. I guess before we go, can you just tell us, maybe coming off of this, it's late afternoon on the East Coast, what's maybe the first thing that we could do to step forward into this, for some of us, new world of activism?
Great question. The first thing that you have to do is actually know what's in your portfolio. What are the funds that you're holding, but also what companies are those funds holding? Until you know what you're actually invested in, and most of us don't, it's pretty hard to know how to move forward. So that would be my first step. Log into your brokerage account, your investment account, your 401k, and start to learn what you are actually holding. If you want to start to learn a little bit about the ESG profiles of the funds that you're holding, as you sow, Ethos ESG and Your Stake all have some great tools where you can go get information about the exposure your fund has to fossil fuel, and what the gender equality looks like in your fund. It's exposure to all different sorts of issues that you might care about. So once you know what you're invested in, you can start to educate yourself about its profile, funds profile, individual companies profiles, and then go from there.
Oh, I should have known you would have dropped so many important little nuggets of information. So yeah, first thing, know what you're invested in. Then use some tools. Asyousow.org is one of the organizations that you mentioned. That's the website URL. Ethos ESG is a tool that financial advisors use. We actually use Your Stake to siphon through the investments for our clients, looking at Ethos as well. So really great information. Know what you're invested in. That is step number one. Well, gee, Dora at Lowson, world traveler, first computer science person, IT person, then finance person just for fun, and then throw on top of that executive leadership and volunteer. Thank you so much for educating us and helping us through the transition of being much more, intentional about our investing. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure, Jason. Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll hopefully see you again. And with that, we yield the balance of your day. Have a meaningful evening. Bye-bye.